Welcome to this Airwalk Reply podcast, The Big Questions in Tech, hosted by Alex Hammond. Joining him are Adam Banks, former Group CTIO of AP Moller Maersk and Board Director for various businesses, Andrew Kirkby, CTO at Vault Sentinel, and Tom Heyes, Organisational Design and Operational Resilience Consultant from Airwalk Reply. Together, they tackle more questions in operational resilience.
Hi, welcome back to The Big Questions in Tech with Airwalk Reply. I'm Alex Hammond, your host, and we are part 2 of Operational Resilience in Financial Services. Welcome back, my guests, Andy, Adam and Tom. Thanks, guys. So, the first time round, many minutes ago, we were talking about some of the fundamentals. What is operational resilience? What's changed? What are the complexities? Where people may be kind of letting perfect be the enemy of good. We touched a bit on that, actually, covering for that 0.1% rather than focusing on having a really robust solution for the 99%, whatever it is. Kind of want to touch a little bit more on maybe some of the tangible things that the folks at home can kind of start to think about, and how can they start to really move the needle, recognising that it is a big, complex beast, whatever scale of organisation you are, but there are some fundamentals that actually can be kind of moved. I want to start with culture, because I think We've done a few sessions with kind of regulatory organisations, etc., and the penny seems to drop when you talk about some of the scenarios that are realities. So you've talked a few times before about, okay, well, actually the first scenario is put your phone and your laptop in a box, and now try and run your organisation. What are you doing? You haven't got any phone numbers for your peers or your staff or whatever it is. How are you running that? And I think that mindset shift the penny hasn't quite dropped yet. Is that fair?
I think it's a very short and sharp view to say just close all your laptops, turn your phones over, and anything you say I'm going to go and do, you have to assume it's gone and now recover from that. And as soon as people get into that mindset, they start to think differently. Right now, the mindset is a DR, resiliency type mindset, and it needs to shift to everything's gone.
So what are the, if you were going to write the kind of 10 commandments of operational resilience minds, I mean, it sounds like one is stop assuming it's not going to happen to you.
So I think that's a very fair assumption.
What are the other kind of key components, would you say, having lived it?
For me, I always look to see whether organisations have a service resumption plan and a business resumption plan.
Okay.
And are they separate? And what I'm looking for is basically the business resumption plan to pick up after their service continuity plan has failed. So literally the business resumption plan starts with, it's all gone.
Yeah.
Now do this.
So where are the like printed run books, walkie-talkies, like whatever it needs to be to run
What you tend to find is in many of the business resumption plans, it says, if this particular thing isn't working, use that other system instead, or use this other system. When you accept it's really gone before you start, you get that creative thinking happening in the business resumption plan, which again means you need not to have to do it on the fly.
Yeah.
You can do it when you've got the time to reflect and think and get all the right people around the table. But really having a plan that you initiate that is almost starting from the doomsday scenario. Yeah. Let's face it, you're not wasting much if you start with 0. No. If you start with 10 out of 100 and you actually find in real life it starts at 3 out of 100, you're stuck. If you start documenting from 0 and the real life is 3, fine, we'll skip the first 3 steps and move on. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And yet there seems to be a real reticence to go back to that almost pre-industrial revolution line of thought and say, okay, we start here.
It seems to be a line of thought that it'll never happen to us.
And I'm blown away by the fact that in 2024 that is still the case. Yeah. I mean, I get really wound up when you hear things like CrowdStrike was a wake-up call. Was maybe the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th wake-up call in the call. Yeah. How many times does the alarm need to go off before someone's going to wake up?
The thought on this as well is that the focus tends to be, we talk about the focus being on backups. The focus people need to tend to think of is their core services and systems as well. So bringing your core data center or your cloud environment online. But if you haven't brought your channels back online, your call centers, your branches and stuff, your core's back, but your customers still can't get their balance and stuff. But so quite often those channels are missed from the overall thing. Channels could be a day 2 thing, and your core's a day 1, but it all has to be part of the plan. But you said the wider business plan has to be, well, what are you going to do with those thousands of people in the call centres.
And I think if we link that thought with the opening thought, don't let perfect be the enemy of better. If you think about a bank, the customer would much rather the first system that came up was the mobile app and it had balances from last night in it than what came up today was the mainframe that they have no access to anyway, and then in 3 days' time the mainframe with a mobile app that tells the correct balance. And yet that's not the way typically people that are thinking through recovery think.
Yeah, it's there's also a thought process as well that I've seen, that they think they need everything back before you can bring service back online. So, example, someone might say, I need my entire SOC back. You don't. You're on Sky News. The regulator standing behind you.
What could go wrong at this point?
There's a core set of things you need back to give your customers the reassurance that their money is okay. You need perhaps a handful of devices that were in your SOC, and the rest of it you do manual workarounds. That's and I'm using SOC just as an example of all of the relevant things in there.
I think we become our own worst enemies until it happens, because we keep considering risk. So, for example, if you said to a bank today, you've gone down tomorrow and you can do cash over the counter and you could record it in a ledger, are you interested? The answer would be no, because it's too high risk. Well, actually, when it happens, you've got nothing to risk because your brand is worth zero.
Yeah.
And therefore, you completely change the way that your risk tolerance changes fundamentally.
It feels like such a big part of this is, like, I have a big bugbear about how airlines operate and how little information you get when your flight's cancelled and you're just on your own. And it feels like such a big part of that is expectation management and communications.
Yeah.
And so if you've planned this ahead of time and you're able to tell your customers exactly what's going to happen and that, yes, we are working on it, but in the meantime, payments will be reconciled in this way, i.e. we've done a deal with this other retail bank that is going to allow those things to happen. Yes, it's a bit painful, but the world will continue and everything will be reconciled and it's going to be okay. It feels like that is 95% of the answer for customers.
I would say wholly it is.
It's the vacuum that people then fill that's the problem, isn't it? More than anything else. You can save your brand a huge amount of damage by addressing those things, which again requires planning. You need to have written these things down. People need to know the script. There's no one. You're not getting everybody onto a Teams call to talk about a PR thing because you can't get on a Teams call. So have these things prepared and save yourself the pain, it feels.
And I think there's also a cultural element to that in terms of, perversely, regulation has made it really hard in financial services to empower employees.
Yeah.
Because you've got an SMF framework, who is the responsible person for X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And in these scenarios, what you need is massively empowered frontline. Whoever is dealing with the customer needs to feel they are acting with the full weight of the bank. And so, for me, on a sunny day rather than an attack type day, how do you get that right balance of culture so that, yes, people are following process and procedure, but they do feel they are owning that customer's problem?
So we've touched on it. There's a lot of operating model parts to this process, run books, scripts, all sorts of things. What are the key things that need to be thought of slightly differently? So, like, crisis management is one of the things that seems to come up a lot.
First on that.
Yes, so the big issue I have with crisis management is the word management.
Right.
Management is a science that's based on information. Right. When this happens, you have no information. So actually the whole concept of managing anything falls apart. It has to be crisis leadership. And so how do you reassure your employees? How do you motivate your employees? How do you get some momentum into what we're doing when all of your normal channels are not there? To your point on customers, how do you create clarity and certainty around certain things for the customer? You may not be able to give them a service, but if you can create clarity to what service you can give them, to your point, if you can create some certainty about when they'll get certain other service, all of that takes the fear away. And a core part of this is removing the ambiguity. Now, that doesn't mean you have to give them information. It just means you remove the ambiguity.
And I think, having been involved in a few different responses over the years, the number of times where as part of the gold team or the corporate crisis top level response, they cascade to the silver team, who cascade to the bronze team, who talk to people on the ground who are actually dealing with the problem. The number of times that then gets translated through that structure, and it's been the misinformation spreads, the Chinese whispers start, and before you know it, the message that's at the top and is going out to the PR team to say this is where we're at is completely and wholly different to probably what was reported 6 hours ago because of the chain of command down at the bottom. And actually that trying to flatten that structure in those responses, and as you say, get closer to the source and the people who understand it, and really try and cut down that time from real time, what's going on the ground, to how are we sharing this back out to our customer base. That, from my experience, isn't that doesn't come from the model that a lot of organisations have at the moment, and that probably needs to be looked at as how do you shorten that time from what's happening.
It's key having some kind of orchestration layer over anything you think of, regardless of the tools. You need to know what all of those people are doing across your company, region, or across. You need, you said, to be as close to that and as real-time updates as you possibly can to avoid that. It'll be half an hour, it'll be an hour, it'll be 2 hours.
To your point, so Maersk, we compressed the structure to 2 levels, in essence. And I don't mean bronze, silver, gold. I mean the entire 100,000 employee structure was compressed to 2 levels. And then I did some of the worst videos you've ever seen, usually lasting 45 seconds. But the 6 hour, you mentioned 6 hours, we were operating on a 6 hour cadence, so we had the exec meeting every 6 hours, and as soon as I came out of that, comms would grab me, hold up an iPhone, and we'd do like 45-second video that they put on Vimeo because we had nowhere else to put it, and sent the password out to all the employees, so via a cascade text. So what it meant was there was only one point of truth, and it would only ever be maximum 6 hours old. Because even if you take a global organisation, you're going to get 12, 14-hour time differences. So if you're not able to distribute that quickly enough, the whole company starts working on different points of truth.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's kind of been true in again, talking more about major incident management and maybe cyber incident management from my experience, but there's still things that have to have that kind of transparency all the way through and often don't. So it's I think a practical step is looking at, in that event, how are you managing that misinformation, information, both internally and then outward, and how are you shortening that window and making sure that what's being presented is correct?
Is it also about bringing together the disparate parts of the organisation? Because again, the historical focus is a little bit IT focused, probably. Okay, IT crisis management, we're going to work out what the issue is, and in the meantime, we'll try and get everything up and running. The business have to play a bigger role in this sort of scenario, don't they?
So I've been through 3 or 4 of these kind of scenarios, and in every one there is a moment that happens.
Right.
And I think the general school
far
of thought,
later than it should have been, I guess.
depended on the company and actually how critical services were, technical services were to their operation.
Okay.
But there is a point of realisation where the CEO realises that even if he fires the CIO, he's going as well.
Yeah.
and that's this sort of I don't know, leverage point. All of a sudden the conversations change.
It's also true of the supply chain as well. That notion could also be like you talk about this notion of the CIO sitting there and looking at the supplier and going, right, we've got 5 hours to fix this, mate. Otherwise, that doesn't fly with the regulator anymore, right? It is on you.
Well, the service is yours, regardless of who runs the system.
Exactly. Yep. How do you get your arms around that? Because it's now the complexity of the supply chain and the role that they play in this now. It is not about your data center and the controls that you have around that. It's about probably 1,000 technology vendors and the vendors that they use. How do you start to get
those suppliers are having the same fixed thoughts that your teams are having? They're still in the DR space and the resilience space. I would say these are the top organizations need to have those meetings with their suppliers and bring them to the same level of understanding as you are on that this will happen to us or to you in that supply chain, and you all have to be equally prepared for it.
So it kind of needs to be part of that planning process, right? Or quite an embedded part potentially in some cases, I guess, right?
I think there's perhaps been a mindset of you potentially outsource some of the liability for these things, and actually by outsourcing the technology service, you sort of done away with the problem. And it's okay if there's a disaster, my supplier on the hook to recover. Well, that's not the case. No. It's your problem. But the challenge there is that you're perhaps talking about contracts that were signed for 7 or 8 years, 3 or 4 years ago, prior to the introduction of some of these regulations, some of these cases, some of the geopolitically where we're at, and it's going to take time to change those underpinning contracts and get around the table with those suppliers and have those conversations about, again, the goalposts have moved. How are we going to overcome this together?
Even more fundamentally, I think, again, if you're to look at the architecture of the bank you designed for the current state, it's highly unlikely you'd be best of breed. Just because you want to deal with the large players, you want to engage with... And at the end of the day, if, let's say, Microsoft Azure goes down, the regulator's not going to be over one bank. They're going to be looking over a whole host of shoulders and very quickly work out that they need to be straight onto the service provider. And so I think there is some... If I was still in the
travel of things, isn't it? They are starting to look quite closely at regulating these providers, aren't they?
But if I was in a CIO role today, I would definitely be not looking so much at best of breed when it comes to my daily service provision.
CrowdStrike was a great example of that one. So it's not necessarily your supply chain that is the financial services supply chain. No. All of your supply chain, they could be very small, they could be global like CrowdStrike that has nothing to do with the financial service you're delivering, but because they're spread over a large number of clients, the impact is the same. Now, we were lucky with CrowdStrike, it was a bug, rather than something that would actually wipe stuff out in a relatively straightforward fix. Change that to, it was an attack at that supplier, and it got into your supply chain and systems, the outcome would have been entirely different.
The scary thing for me on that, I mean, the fix for CrowdStrike was a minute.
Yes.
To actually go in and and yet we had companies down for 3 days.
Yeah.
So upscale that to the fix is now rebuild the device, which is going to take you 8 to 12 hours.
Yeah.
We would have had companies that never came back.
And it just showed with that I don't think organisations weren't even prepared for that kind of event to happen, which, as you said, was a bug rather than a malicious attack. And as you said, for those 3 days, with the process that they had, would have become 10 days, 20 days.
Yeah. And then you've got the systemic problems, like depending on who goes out for 20 days, that's financial crisis territory, isn't it?
Yes.
It comes back as well to the supply chain. Is that if you're using the same supply chain as everyone else, you're all gonna drop out at the same time. So that needs to be thought of, and that's something I've always thought about the definition of cyber resilience. So the industry calls it cyber resilience and having a recovery plan. This might be my personal view, right? Cyber recovery is when you've lost everything and you have to recover. That's the operational part to me. Cyber resilience, and the word resilience means you haven't lost service because you are resilient. So to me, cyber resilience would be, for example, don't have your application developed on a single platform. Share it across multiple platforms. So if you have a platform attack, only half your service is lost. You still maintain service underneath.
And this, it comes back to that kind of mindset shift and that behaviour shift. Think about things like concentration risk. Have we put all of our eggs in one or a couple of baskets? And actually, what's our ability to change or pivot away from those things should the worst happen? And again, that comes back to architectural standards, supplier choice, decision making. There are so many things that come together to make this, and that's where you get in the critical third party regulation, and all of this is about the mindset and trying to shift the mindset from where it is at the moment in terms of we've got some technology with a supplier and we trust them to manage it to a set of service levels, and we trust them to recover it within the tolerance that they've defined within the contract. And actually we've looked to cross the piece and we've understood where our risk points are and how we can effectively build out a more resilient plan and dilute that concentration risk across our estate so that should the worst happen, we're covered.
So you said one of the practical things organisations can do. I was hugely fortunate to have been rehearsed every quarter for 13 years. I can't tell you how useful a skill to fall back on that was. I'll be honest, I hadn't even I'd been 7 years out of that organisation, so I hadn't even remembered I knew it. But I would say organisations at a gold level need to be rehearsing quarterly, and they need to be highly realistic scenarios.
Actually, the reality is that we were in a forum recently, and the assertion that they might test some of these things, let alone rehearse it end to end once a year, was excessive.
Yeah.
So the mindset just isn't there.
But again, if you take the scenario, you may have lost 3 of the exco because they were abroad on business trips on away team, and they can't dial in because you've got no.
Yeah.
Who's running that meeting?
Yeah.
You need every single person on that exco to be ready to step in as gold lead or whatever the term is in that business. And I don't see that often in many companies.
Thank you very much, gents. Really appreciate your time. Hope you enjoyed it. That was The Big Questions in Tech with Eric Reply. We'll see you next time.
Subscribe now to never miss an episode of The Big Questions in Tech.